never imagined I would see my own daughter look at me with that kind of fury. Not the dramatic, teenage anger that fades after slammed doors and silent dinners, but something darker, colder, as if years of resentment had finally found its voice. The moment is burned into my memory like a scar that never healed. It was early evening, the kind of quiet hour when the house usually feels safe, familiar. I had just finished folding laundry, humming softly to myself, when I heard her footsteps, fast, heavy, deliberate. Before I could even turn around, she was standing there, eyes blazing, fists clenched, her entire body trembling with emotion she no longer bothered to hide. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she shouted, her voice cracking the silence like shattered glass. I stood frozen, completely blindsided. My mind scrambled, searching for answers, replaying conversations, moments, memories, anything that could explain this sudden explosion. But there was nothing. No warning. No argument earlier. No harsh words exchanged. Just this raw, unfiltered rage aimed straight at me. She didn't wait for a response. She never did when she was like this. Words poured out of her in a flood. Accusations, half-truths, things twisted so badly I barely recognized them. According to her, I had ruined her life. I had embarrassed her. I had crossed lines I didn't even know existed. Each sentence felt like a slap, not because it hurt my pride, but because it came from someone I loved more than my own breath. Someone I had raised, protected, sacrificed for, often silently, often without recognition. As she spoke, I noticed details that made my heart sink even deeper. The way she refused to meet my eyes. The way her jaw tightened whenever I tried to speak. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. This had been rehearsed in her mind, fueled by conversations I wasn't part of. Opinions shaped by people who didn't know the full story. I wasn't arguing with my daughter anymore. I was standing trial, convicted without ever being heard. I tried to calm her, tried to understand. I asked softly, "What are you talking about? Please just explain." But my words only seemed to enrage her further. She laughed, a short, bitter sound that didn't belong to the little girl who once ran into my arms after school. "Explain," she snapped. "You've been explaining your whole life. Twisting things. Playing the victim." That's when I realized something terrifying. She didn't want answers. She wanted blame. And I was the easiest target. As she stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her, I sank into the nearest chair, my legs suddenly too weak to hold me. My heart pounded painfully in my chest, not from anger, but from shock and heartbreak. I had always believed that no matter how complicated life became, no matter how many mistakes we made, family would be the one place where love remained unconditional. That belief shattered that evening. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't possibly have known, was that this confrontation was only the beginning. That night was the first crack in a truth that had been forming quietly for years. A truth about betrayal, manipulation, and the painful realization that sometimes, the people you protect the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. And as I sat alone in that silent house, staring at the closed door behind which my daughter had disappeared, one question echoed relentlessly in my mind. How did we get here? That night, sleep refused to come to me. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying my daughter's words again and again, each sentence echoing louder than the last. Every accusation twisted itself deeper into my chest, not because I believed them, but because I didn't understand how she could. I kept asking myself where I had failed, what moment, what choice, what silence had planted this anger inside her. Parenthood, I realized, doesn't come with a final exam you know you've passed. You only find out years later, when the consequences stand in front of you, furious and unforgiving. By morning, the house felt different. Heavier. Colder. I moved through the kitchen quietly, almost afraid of making noise, as if any sound might trigger another explosion. My daughter didn't come down for breakfast. Her door stayed shut, a silent reminder that something between us had broken. I tried to distract myself, washed dishes that were already clean, wiped counters that didn't need wiping, but my hands moved while my mind stayed trapped in the past. I remembered the nights I stayed awake when she was sick, counting her breaths just to make sure she was still okay. The school meetings I attended alone. The The sacrifices I made without ever telling her, because that's what parents do. You give without keeping score. And yet somehow in her version of the story, I had become the villain. That realization hurt more than her shouting ever could. Later that afternoon, I finally gathered the courage to knock on her door. My heart raced like I was about to face a stranger. When she opened it, her expression was guarded, distant. Gone was the rage from the night before, replaced by something colder, detachment. That scared me more. Anger can burn out, but distance? Distance settles in. I just want to understand, I said quietly. Please, tell me what's really going on. She hesitated, then stepped aside, letting me in. Her room looked exactly the same, yet it felt unfamiliar, like I was standing in a place I no longer belonged. She crossed her arms and leaned against the window, avoiding my gaze. Then slowly she began to speak. What followed wasn't one single issue, but years of resentment piled together. Misunderstandings, moments taken out of context, things said by others that she never bothered to question. Someone had been feeding her a narrative where I was controlling, selfish, always interfering. And over time, she had accepted it as truth. The most painful part wasn't what she accused me of. It was realizing how little she trusted me. She had believed everyone else before ever coming to me. Friends, extended family, even strangers' opinions mattered more than my voice. When I tried to correct her, she interrupted me. You always do this, she said. You always try to explain instead of just admitting you're wrong. That's when I understood something devastating. This wasn't about facts. It was about feelings she had been carrying for a long time. Feelings that no explanation could erase overnight. I could defend myself endlessly and still lose, because in her heart, the story had already been written. When I left her room, my hands were shaking. I felt smaller than I ever had before. Not because I was powerless, but because I finally saw the truth. Loving someone doesn't guarantee they will understand you. Being a good parent doesn't protect you from being misunderstood. And sometimes the role of mother comes with a silent expectation to absorb blame without ever breaking. That evening, I sat alone again, but this time something inside me shifted. The sadness was still there, heavy and suffocating, but beneath it was a quiet clarity. I had spent my life trying to keep the peace, apologizing even when I didn't know what I had done wrong. But this situation demanded something different. Not anger, not silence, but boundaries. I didn't know yet how things would unfold. I didn't know whether my daughter would ever see the full truth, or whether this distance would grow into something permanent. All I knew was this. I could no longer carry blame that wasn't mine. And whatever came next would force me to choose between protecting my relationship or protecting myself. What I didn't realize then was that the hardest moment was still ahead. Because sometimes, the deepest wounds don't come from confrontation. They come from what happens after the silence. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. The house existed in an uneasy silence, the kind that presses against your chest until breathing feels like work. My daughter moved around me like I was a piece of furniture, present, unavoidable, but invisible. No greetings, no eye contact, no arguments either. Just absence. I realized then that silence could be far more cruel than shouting, because at least anger acknowledges your existence. This felt like erasure. I replayed our conversation again and again, wondering which words I should have chosen differently, which pauses I should have filled, but the truth was brutal. No perfect sentence would have changed what she had already decided to believe. She had been carrying a version of me that didn't exist, and somehow, it had become more real to her than the woman who raised her. One afternoon, I overheard her on the phone again. This time she wasn't angry, she was confident. Confident in her narrative, confident in her decision to keep her distance. She spoke about me as if I were a problem she was finally learning how to manage. That was the moment something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly and permanently. I realized I had spent decades bending myself into whatever shape my children needed, believing that love meant endless flexibility. But love without limits slowly becomes self-erasure. And I was dangerously close to disappearing completely. That night, I sat at the dining table with old photo albums spread out in front of me. Page after page of memories stared back. Birthdays I organized alone, school plays I attended even when exhausted, holidays I stretched every dollar to make magical. I wasn't looking for validation anymore. I was grounding myself in truth. These moments happened. This love existed. No amount of rewritten history could take that away from me. And for the first time, instead of asking myself what I did wrong, I asked a different question. What if I didn't fail? What if she simply chose not to see me? The next morning, I made a decision that scared me more than confrontation ever had. I stopped trying. I didn't chase her for conversation. I didn't apologize for things I hadn't done. I didn't explain myself to people who had already made up their minds. I focused on myself, small things at first. Morning walks, reading again, calling an old friend I had neglected for years. It felt strange, almost selfish, but also strangely liberating. I had forgotten that I was a person beyond being a mother. That change didn't go unnoticed. A few days later, my daughter finally confronted me, not with anger, but with confusion. She asked why I was acting distant. The irony almost made me laugh. For once, I answered honestly. I told her I was tired of defending myself against accusations that never came from my actions, only from assumptions. I told her I loved her deeply, but I would no longer accept being treated like an enemy in my own home. My voice didn't shake. I didn't cry. And that steadiness unsettled her more than tears ever could. She didn't respond right away. She looked at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time. Not as a role, not as an expectation, but as a human being with limits. For a moment, I thought maybe this was the turning point. But healing, I learned, doesn't happen in cinematic moments. It happens slowly, or sometimes not at all. That evening, she packed a bag. Not permanently, she said. Just space. The word felt heavy, loaded with uncertainty. I watched her leave without begging her to stay, without collapsing into guilt. It hurt, God, it hurt, but it also felt necessary. Some relationships need distance to survive. Others reveal their true shape only when tested by it. As the door closed behind her, I stood alone in the quiet house once more. But this time, the silence didn't crush me. It echoed, yes, but it also gave me room to breathe. I didn't know whether my daughter would come back with understanding or return even further away. What I did know was this. I had finally stopped abandoning myself for the sake of keeping peace. And somewhere deep inside, a small, steady voice whispered a truth I had ignored for years. Sometimes the bravest thing a parent can do is stop sacrificing themselves to be loved. The days after my daughter left felt unreal, as if time itself had slowed down to watch what I would do next. Every corner of the house carried her presence. The faint scent of her perfume on the couch, the mug she always used left untouched in the sink, the quiet hum of her room that now felt like a sealed chapter of my life. I told myself I was fine, that I had chosen this distance for my own sanity, but grief doesn't disappear just because you understand it. It settles in quietly, showing up in small moments. When I reached for my phone to text her something trivial, or when I cooked too much food out of habit. Still, beneath the ache, there was a strange calm. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing myself for criticism, disappointment, or emotional whiplash. I wasn't walking on eggshells in my own home. One afternoon, as I sat by the window watching the world move on without me, I realized how long I had lived in reaction mode. My choices, my words, even my silence had always been shaped by how my children might interpret them. I had mistaken that constant self-monitoring for love. But love that requires you to disappear is not love, it's endurance. That realization was painful, but also clarifying. I began to see how my daughter's anger wasn't born overnight. It had been fed slowly by expectations, by comparisons, by stories she told herself when life didn't go the way she wanted. Somewhere along the line, I became the safest place to deposit her resentment. A week later, she called. Her voice was guarded, cautious, as if she were stepping onto thin ice. She said she'd been thinking a lot. That distance had made her notice how much I actually did, how much space I had always given her without asking for anything in return. I listened quietly, resisting the urge to interrupt, to defend myself, to turn the conversation into a courtroom where I finally proved my innocence. Instead, I let her speak. I had learned that sometimes people need to hear their own thoughts out loud before they can recognize their weight. She admitted that she had been angry long before our argument, angry at her life, her marriage, her own unmet dreams. And instead of facing that, she found it easier to aim it at me. Mothers are convenient targets. We're expected to absorb everything and remain loving afterward. When she said she was sorry, I believed she meant it. But apology alone doesn't rebuild trust. I told her that forgiveness wasn't something I could rush, not because I wanted to punish her, but because I needed to protect myself this time. There was silence on the line, heavy but honest. Then she asked a question that surprised me. She asked who I was now, without constantly revolving around her needs. I told her the truth, that I was still figuring it out, that I had spent so many years being mom, that I forgot what brought me joy before that title defined me. I told her I was learning to sit with myself again, to like my own company, to stop apologizing for taking up space. When she returned a few days later, things were different, not magically healed, not perfect, but different. She didn't act entitled to my emotional labor. She didn't demand reassurance. She observed me instead, as if recalibrating her understanding of who I was. And I noticed something else too. She seemed unsettled by my calm. My boundaries forced her to confront her own behavior in a way my silence never had. That night, after she went to bed, I stayed awake thinking about how love evolves, how parenting adult children requires a courage no one prepares you for. The courage to let go of control, to accept misunderstanding, and sometimes, to risk being seen as the villain in someone else's story. I realized that choosing myself didn't mean I loved my daughter less. It meant I loved us both enough to stop pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. By morning, I felt lighter. Not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer shrinking to maintain harmony. I had finally learned that peace built on self-betrayal is not peace at all. And whatever came next, whether reconciliation or continued distance, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I would never again abandon myself just to be needed. After that night, something subtle but irreversible shifted inside me. It wasn't dramatic, there were no grand speeches or confrontations, but I woke up with a quiet resolve that felt stronger than any anger I had ever known. For the first time, I stopped measuring my worth by how needed I was. I began doing small things just for myself. Taking longer walks without explaining where I was going. Rearranging the living room the way I liked it instead of how it had always been. Cooking meals that pleased me even if no one else touched them. These changes may sound insignificant, but for someone who had spent decades centering everyone else, they felt almost rebellious. I noticed how my daughter watched these changes with a mixture of confusion and discomfort. My independence challenged the version of me she had grown used to, the endlessly available mother, the emotional safety net, the woman who existed on standby. And I realized that part of her anger had always come from that imbalance. She had relied on my constant presence, without ever considering the cost. One afternoon, while we sat at the kitchen table drinking tea, she asked me if I ever regretted being a mother. The question hung between us, raw and unfiltered. I took a long breath before answering, because honesty mattered more than reassurance now. I told her I never regretted loving her, but I did regret how completely I erased myself in the process. I told her that I thought sacrifice was the same as love. And it took me years to understand that love should not leave you hollow. My words unsettled her. I could see it in her eyes. The realization that my exhaustion, my quiet sadness, my patience stretched thin over the years hadn't been personality traits, but consequences. That conversation marked another turning point. She became quieter, more reflective. Not kinder overnight, not suddenly transformed, but aware. Awareness is uncomfortable. It forces people to confront themselves. And I understood then that healing doesn't come from dramatic apologies or emotional declarations. It comes from sustained change. From showing up differently consistently. I stopped rescuing her from every problem. When she complained about her marriage, I listened without offering solutions. When she expected me to pick sides, I declined. At first she pushed back. She accused me of being distant, of changing. I told her calmly that I had changed, because I needed to survive myself. There were moments when doubt crept in. Nights when I wondered if I was being selfish, if I was risking losing her forever. But every time those fears surfaced, I reminded myself of the woman I had been before, tired, anxious, invisible. I reminded myself that staying silent had never protected our relationship. It had only delayed the inevitable breakdown. Boundaries, I learned, don't destroy love. They reveal whether it was ever mutual to begin with. Weeks passed, and slowly, something softened between us. She began asking questions instead of making demands. She started thanking me for things she had once taken for granted. The shift wasn't perfect or linear. Some days were tense, others surprisingly warm, but it was real. And for the first time, our interactions didn't leave me drained. They left me steady, grounded. One evening, after she had gone home, I stood alone in my kitchen and realized how different the silence felt now. It wasn't heavy or lonely. It was peaceful. I understood then that reclaiming my voice hadn't pushed my daughter away. It had invited her to meet me as an equal. And if she chose not to, I was finally strong enough to live with that. I had spent so many years teaching my children how to stand on their own feet. Yet I had forgotten to do the same for myself. Now, at this stage of my life, I wasn't seeking approval or validation. I was seeking truth. And the truth was simple, even if it had taken decades to accept. I was allowed to exist beyond my role as a mother. I was allowed to choose myself without guilt. And that choice, once made, changed everything. What surprised me most in the weeks that followed was not how my daughter changed, but how much I did. I began noticing things I had ignored for years. How my shoulders no longer felt tense all the time. How I slept through the night without replaying conversations in my head. How I laughed more freely without checking whether it was appropriate or welcome. I realized that I had lived in a constant state of emotional alertness, always anticipating someone else's needs before they were even voiced. Letting go of that habit felt like learning to breathe again after holding my breath for decades. I didn't announce my transformation or demand acknowledgement for it. I simply lived differently, and that difference spoke louder than any argument ever could. My daughter started calling me more often, not to complain or unload, but to talk. Sometimes about her work, sometimes about trivial things, sometimes about memories from her childhood that she had never revisited before. One afternoon, she mentioned a moment from when she was little, how she used to pretend to be asleep, so I would carry her to bed, because she liked the feeling of safety in my arms. Her voice cracked when she said it, and I felt a quiet ache bloom in my chest. That memory reminded us both that our relationship hadn't always been strained. It had been layered: love, dependence, misunderstanding, unmet expectations, all tangled together over time. I realized then that resentment often grows in silence, watered by assumptions. She had assumed I was strong enough to handle everything. I had assumed that being needed was the same as being loved. Neither of us had meant harm, yet harm had happened anyway. Acknowledging that truth didn't erase the past, but it softened its sharpest edges. For the first time, we were not defending our versions of reality. We were listening. Still, healing wasn't smooth. There were setbacks. Days when old habits resurfaced, when she expected more than I could give, or when I felt the familiar urge to step in and fix things. Each time I paused, I reminded myself that growth isn't about perfection, it's about awareness. And awareness gave me the power to choose differently. Sometimes I chose distance. Sometimes I chose compassion. But every choice was conscious, not automatic. What I hadn't expected was how others reacted. Friends noticed the change. Some admired it. Others felt unsettled by it. A few even questioned it, asking why I had become so firm, at my age, as if self-respect had an expiration date. Their questions didn't bother me the way they once would have. I no longer felt the need to justify my boundaries or explain my healing. I had learned that people who benefit from your silence often feel threatened when you finally speak. There was one evening that stays with me vividly. My daughter came over unannounced, her face tired, her eyes heavy with emotion. She didn't sit right away. She stood in the doorway and said quietly, "I didn't realize how much pressure I put on you until you stopped carrying it." There was no accusation in her voice, only reflection. That moment didn't fix everything, but it mattered. It was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement is often the beginning of repair. As she spoke, I felt something settle inside me. Not triumph, not vindication, peace. I didn't need her to fully understand everything I had endured. I only needed her to see me as a person, not a resource. That night, after she left, I made myself dinner and ate it slowly, savoring the quiet. I thought about how many years I had rushed through my own life, always prioritizing the needs of others. I promised myself then that whatever time I had left would be lived with intention. I began making plans, not grand ones, but meaningful ones. A short trip I had always postponed. A class I had wanted to take. Reconnecting with an old friend. These plans weren't escapes, they were affirmations. Proof that my life was still unfolding, still mine to shape. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting for permission. I wasn't hoping for approval. I was simply moving forward. Calmly, deliberately, with a clarity that came from finally choosing myself. And that choice didn't diminish my love for my daughter. It strengthened it, because it was no longer rooted in sacrifice alone, but in mutual respect. The real test of everything I had learned came unexpectedly, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a quiet moment that could have easily gone unnoticed. It was a Sunday afternoon when my daughter called, her voice hesitant, asking if I could watch her children for a few hours because she felt overwhelmed. For a split second, the old instinct surged back. The reflex to say yes immediately, to rearrange my entire day without question. But this time I paused. I listened not just to her words, but to my own body, my own energy. I told her honestly that I could help, but only for a limited time, and that I would need rest afterward. There was a silence on the line, and in that silence, I felt the weight of years shifting. She agreed. No guilt, no persuasion, no ressentimento. Just acceptance. That moment, simple as it was, felt like a quiet revolution. When she arrived with the children, something was different. She didn't rush off without explanation. She knelt, spoke to them gently, and thanked me before leaving. I watched from the doorway, not with exhaustion or obligation, but with a calm sense of choice. I realized then that boundaries don't push people away when they are rooted in honesty. They teach others how to treat you. The afternoon passed peacefully. The children played, we laughed, and when the agreed time came, my daughter returned exactly when she said she would. No excuses. No assumptions. Just respect. Later that evening, after the house had settled back into silence, I sat by the window and reflected on how far we had come. Healing, I learned, doesn't always arrive in grand apologies or emotional speeches. Sometimes it shows up in small behavioral changes, in consistency, in the quiet honoring of someone else's limits. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. There was a difference. I also noticed how my own reactions had softened. I no longer carried the sharp edge of resentment, nor the heavy burden of self-sacrifice. I had found a middle ground, where love existed without erasure, where care didn't mean depletion. That balance felt fragile at first, like something that could be lost if mishandled, but over time it grew stronger, more natural. One evening, my daughter sat across from me at the kitchen table, turning her mug slowly in her hands. She looked up and said something I never expected to hear. "I'm trying to unlearn what I thought love looked like." Those words landed deeply. They told me that my change had given her permission to change too. Not because I demanded it, but because I modeled something different. I realized then that generational patterns don't break through confrontation alone. They break when someone quietly chooses a new way. When someone stops absorbing harm and starts responding with clarity. My daughter wasn't suddenly perfect, and neither was I. But we were learning, together and apart. As the days went on, I found myself no longer bracing for interactions with her. I didn't rehearse conversations in advance or prepare defenses. I showed up as I was, open but firm, loving but whole. And in doing so, I reclaimed parts of myself I had long forgotten. My curiosity, my humor, my sense of possibility. I understood something vital then. I hadn't lost my daughter when I stopped sacrificing myself. I found her again, on different terms, healthier terms. And more importantly, I found myself. That realization didn't come with fireworks or fanfare. It came with a quiet confidence. The kind that settles deep in your bones and tells you that you're finally standing on your own ground. Today, when I look back at the woman I once was, the one who stayed silent to keep the peace, who carried guilt that was never hers, who believed love meant endurance, I don't feel shame. I feel compassion. She did the best she could with what she knew at the time. But I am not her anymore. I have learned that love does not require suffering to prove its worth. And family does not get a lifetime pass to hurt you simply because they share your blood. My relationship with my daughter is no longer built on fear or obligation, but on honesty and mutual effort. Some days are still awkward. Some conversations still carry tension. But they are real, and real is better than perfect. I've also learned that healing doesn't always mean reconciliation in the way we imagine. Sometimes it means redefining closeness. Sometimes it means loving from a distance that protects your peace. And sometimes it means choosing yourself without apology. I no longer wait for validation to feel whole. I no longer shrink to make others comfortable. I stand in my truth quietly, firmly, and without bitterness. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself in my story, if you've been the one expected to bend, to absorb, to stay quiet, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not selfish for setting boundaries. You are not cruel for choosing rest. You are not wrong for wanting respect. Change may scare the people who benefited from your silence, but that doesn't make it wrong. Life doesn't end when you stop being everything to everyone else. In many ways, that's when it finally begins. I wake up now with a lighter heart. I laugh more freely. I feel present in my own life. And that, more than any apology or approval, is the proof that choosing myself was the right decision. This is not a story about cutting ties. It's a story about cutting patterns. About ending cycles quietly. About realizing that your worth was never up for debate. And if my story gives even one person the courage to pause, to breathe, and to choose themselves, then every painful moment that led me here was not wasted.